On May 18th, 1980, more than 50 people died in a disaster that many of them saw coming, and yet stayed. What makes this story different from any other is not just the force of the explosion, nor the escalation of the destruction. It's the fact that for weeks the signs were there, clear, repeated, persistent, and yet ignored. That morning the sky didn't gradually darken. There was no time for adaptation, for the event to unfold, to understand what was happening. In a matter of seconds, the world changed violently, as if the earth itself had decided to break apart without final warning. But the warning exists. It began weeks before. Small tremors began to shake the ground around Mount St. Helens. At first, nothing alarming. The region already knew seismic activity. But there was something different. The frequency increased. The intensity varied. The pattern was not stable. And then something happened that no one could completely ignore. The mountain began to change shape. A bulge appeared on the north face. Small at first, but growing every day. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was measurable. About 1.5 meters a day. Every day. Imagine looking at a mountain and realizing it's growing sideways. Not upwards, sideways. It all officially began in March 1980, when an earthquake broke the silence of more than a century. Mount St. Helens had been dormant for 123 years. For many, it was just part of the landscape. Beautiful, imposing, harmless. But that first tremor changed that, and the problem wasn't the tremor, it was what came after. In the following days, the tremors began to repeat themselves, first sporadic, then frequent, then constant. The ground seemed restless, unstable, as if something was slowly moving in the depths. For scientists, the initial explanation was clear. Rising magma. When magma rises, it breaks rocks, displaces structures, and releases gases. This process generates relatively predictable signals, and it is this predictability that allows us to anticipate the behavior of a volcano. But at Mount St. Helens, these signals weren't matching up. Gas levels weren't increasing as expected. Sulfur dioxide, one of the main indicators of activity, remained low. This created a contradiction that was difficult to ignore. The mountain was clearly active, but it wasn't behaving as it should. And then came the detail that completely changed the interpretation of the event. The bulge on the north face continued to grow. Too fast. Too big. In a few weeks, the mountain structure had shifted hundreds of meters outward. This is not normal. This is not stable. This is accumulated pressure with no way out. And this raises a question that at that moment, no one could answer with certainty. If this pressure isn't going to be released upwards, where is it going? This doubt began to increasingly bother the experts. But outside this circle, the effect was the opposite. The days passed, and nothing happened. No explosion, no collapse, no immediate disaster, and this began to change people's behavior. The initial fear began to fade. The risk started to seem exaggerated. Restrictions began to be questioned. Some areas were partially reopened. Residents tried to return to their homes, because when disaster doesn't happen, the brain starts to believe it won't happen. But the mountain didn't stop. It continued to grow. It continued to deform. It continued to accumulate pressure, and the silence began to become more dangerous than the noise, because now nobody was really paying attention. And perhaps that was the most critical part of the whole story, the moment when the danger still existed, but ceased to be taken seriously. The night before the disaster was strangely calm. The sky was clear, the wind practically non-existent, and nothing indicated that in a few hours, everything would change irreversibly. It was the kind of calm that deceives, that creates a false sense of security. And that's exactly what happened. On the morning of May 18th, people woke up as on any other day. Some were working, others observing the mountain, some simply going about their routines. And the mountain was still there, silent, immobile. But that silence wasn't empty. It was accumulated pressure. At 8:32 a.m., a stronger earthquake shattered this apparent tranquility. It wasn't just another tremor, it was the breaking point. The north face of the mountain, already weakened, couldn't withstand it any longer. It collapsed, abruptly, violently, instantaneously. The largest landslide in recorded history began at that moment. Millions of tons of rock descended at high speed, exposing the volcano's interior and releasing pressure that had been building up for weeks. And then the explosion happened. But not as everyone expected. It wasn't upwards. It was sideways. A devastating lateral force swept across the landscape at absurd speed. A mixture of superheated gas, ash, and rocks, advancing too fast for any reaction. Entire forests disappeared in seconds. Centuries-old trees were felled as if they were fragile. The air became unbreathable. The sky disappeared. Some people saw it coming and understood, but there was no more time. One scientist managed to transmit one last message before disappearing. A photographer continued recording images until the very last moment, and then protected the film with his own body. Others simply didn't have a chance. And even after the initial explosion, the disaster continued. Pyroclastic flows surged forward, burning everything in their path. Ash rose to extreme heights, generating electrical discharges in the sky itself. The heat melted glaciers instantly, and the water turned into mud, dense, heavy, destructive. Lahars descended through the valleys like moving concrete, destroying bridges, burying roads, and sweeping away everything in their path. The environment ceased to be recognizable, and those who survived were lost in a place that no longer seemed like the same world. When it was all over, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence anymore. It wasn't peace. It wasn't relief. It was a heavy emptiness, difficult to explain. More than 50 people had died, some without even understanding what was happening. Others, too aware, trapped in decisions that hours before seemed perfectly reasonable. To stay a little longer, to wait another day, to go back just to get a few things, small decisions, irreversible consequences. The landscape had been completely transformed. The mountaintop simply ceased to exist as before. Hundreds of meters were torn away, as if they had never been there. Entire forests disappeared. Rivers changed course. What was once recognizable now looked like another planet. But the deepest impact wasn't in the visible destruction. It was in the understanding that came after. When scientists began to reconstruct what happened, they realized something unsettling. Mount St. Helens didn't follow the expected pattern. He didn't give the classic final warning signs. He didn't release pressure as predicted. He ruptured, in a way no one was truly prepared to see. Sideways, quickly, violently, silently, until the very last second. And that changed everything, because it means that not all disasters follow a clear script. It means that sometimes danger doesn't come with a dramatic final warning. It comes with weeks of signs that seem insufficient, ignorable, postponable. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of this whole story. It wasn't just the force of the eruption. It was the fact that, in many cases, there was time to get out, time to decide differently, time to heed the signs. But time was underestimated. Over the years, nature began to recover. Life slowly returned. Plants grew where there was only ash before. Animals returned. The scene, little by little, ceased to seem like an end and began to seem like a new beginning. But the mountain never returned to what it was. It is still active. It still moves. It still accumulates pressure, invisible to the eyes of those who don't know what to look for. And today, we know more. We know how to identify tremors. We know how to measure deformations. We know how to recognize patterns. But this raises an uncomfortable question. Is knowing enough? Because in the end, this story isn't just about a volcano. It's about human behavior, about the moment when the warning exists, but doesn't seem urgent enough, about the choice to wait just a little longer, and about how sometimes that little longer is exactly what separates life from the irreversible. And perhaps, at this very moment, somewhere in the world, there is another mountain